Hello everyone and welcome to Conversations with Khufane. I'm Khufane Modise, and today we'll be exploring the intersection between energy policy and early childhood development, and the gentleman that's going to be helping us explore this topic is Khule Duma. Hi Khule.
Hi, Khule. Thank you for having us here.
Thanks for being part of this conversation. Just give us a brief background of who you are and the work that you do.
Great. So my name is Khule Duma, as you've said. And I'm a director in the presidency, specifically in the project management office, which the best way to describe it is as a delivery unit established after 2020, or rather the beginning of the sixth administration by the president. And basically the idea is to look at the very key deliverables in the president's agenda, and making sure that you've got people in the center of government that are able to coordinate across government on those particular objectives, right? So there's a number of focus areas that we look at. Of course, energy, logistics, trying to make sure that we deal with red tape, or reduction of red tape rather. And then there's also some work as well that's looking at the just energy transition. Effectively, there's a lot of work. There's even some digital transformation stuff. So it's a small team. There's about 5 of us, but in total we work with a array of partners and people that really help us to deliver across government and in society.
Yeah, I mean, as I would say, a key player in the just energy transition in South Africa, how does early childhood development play a part in what you guys do? What's going on? What's the intersection there?
Yeah, well, you wouldn't naturally think that there's an intersection there. And in many instances, I don't think we naturally thought that the intersection was there. In fact, it's this whole kind of being partnership led that becomes quite key, because what actually happened was we were obviously there is the Just Energy Transition Project Management Unit that had been established, that is run by Joanne Yawich, and they have quite a great team there. And as part of my role, I was supporting there. But when I was speaking, in fact, to some of the board members of Breadline, and we were talking about an array of work, they had brought up the fact that there was actually a connection between just transition and ECD, right? And as we started to explore it with the team, I got in touch with the team. It became quite clear that it was there. And in fact, the big thing is, if you think about Mpumalanga, which is the core of the just energy transition in South Africa, the change from one economic model to another, namely the fact that you're focused on fossil fuels, and now you're moving to a kind of more diversified economy in some sense, has major implications for that society, right? All the way from the bottom to the top, because the means and ways that people are getting in employment, the migration patterns and all of those are effectively changing, right? And hence it's a transition. So it does make sense that at the level of the children who live there, the employment that they one day are going to get, that you've really got to start to make a kind of a connection between that, right? So, for example, if the idea was these are children that are going to go into coal mines, the children that are going to go into energy plants, how do you start very early to ensure that they are capacitated for renewable energy jobs, green manufacturing jobs, or even agriculture, for example. And as we know, we often start thinking about that stuff at like high school, secondary level, right? Because we're like, well, this is, you choose your subjects and now you're going to go in this direction. But we all know, and I'm sure, the guests before have spoken about this, the most important time in a child's life is those first 1,000 days, right? That really builds the foundation. So there's no way you can be talking about a pipeline of employment, of skills and so on, without really thinking about the foundations. It's not so much that we're going into ECD centers and saying, this is renewable energy. That's not what we're doing. But what we're doing is just getting the basics right, to ensure that when they go into high school, when they go into university, they are capacitated to really take advantage of these jobs that are going to be coming in the future.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, when you observe towns like Komati that are transitioning, what would you say is your greatest observation are both positive and negative.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, Komati is quite interesting, and it has a particular imagination in the country, right? Because as we know, this in some sense has been ground zero, right? There's a power station that was decommissioned, and in many instances, there's been a host of partners that have looked at this particular town. But I think when I look in a place like Komati, there's actually a big amount of hope that's there, right? When you engage with the communities, there's the sense that, look, even though maybe the transition didn't go in the way that they wanted, right? In the sense that maybe the planning didn't take place as it was. And there's acknowledgement widely that in many instances, in a place like Komati, the planning could have been better. It could have been better embedded into the kind of decommissioning project and strategy going forward. But people are actually quite hopeful about what could come, right? And what they want most of all is just to make sure that they're engaged in the process. That they are also not treated as people who, here comes, government, or here comes the social partner, and it has all of the answers. And in fact, you cannot be consulted because, you're not an educated individual. These are extremely educated and experienced people, boiler makers and, tech skills that are in great demand in the economy, right? And you've got to treat them as such. You've got to treat them that they know how to design their own destiny going forward. So this is something that I observe in these places, and so the onus is on us in many instances to find what I'd say is mechanisms and ways of consultation that doesn't just tell people what we're going to do, but really involves them in the solution themselves, right? And I think when you do that, you find that people are a bit more hospitable to what you're bringing. People are a bit more excited, and in fact, people see a role for themselves in that particular transition. Now, I don't think we've necessarily gotten that right across the board, but I'm hoping that in Komati, we're starting to build some of that muscle, memory that will enable us to do it better in other parts of the country and other parts of the province.
I'd love for you to touch on this, because I think it's so unfortunate that I didn't think that initiatives that are on just energy transition had a part to play with had a part to play to communities like Komati. And I think it's unfortunate because just based on the way you're explaining it, it just seems so apparent to me. I'm like, obviously. And I think this is a foundational conversation for many other governments in various countries. I'm from Botswana, and there was, a town that was just flourishing. It was great. It was a mining town, and then it got decommissioned, and it became a ghost town. And then trying to reestablish that economy has just been the slowest process. And it's like, how does this happen? And what happened to the sustainability goals that you guys had initially when you gave us this big dream about how this town's going to flourish, and then 10, 20 years later, it's nothing. What then? Like, how should governments approach these things? Because obviously, if we're looking at the fact that maybe 10 years down the line, or maybe 20 years down the line, this mining company might not necessarily be here for long. What systems can we put in place to ensure that these towns or these communities aren't left desolate?
No, I think that's it's a really good question. And in fact, it's not just you mentioned mining towns. It's not just an issue that governments alone need to face. It's also things that companies in mining towns as well. I mean, in many instances, many parts of South Africa, the way they are because of just how companies have, in some sense, transitioned out, right? And it's also, I think, in some sense, true in Botswana as well, where kind of derelict diamond mines have been left. So it is a big challenge. I think the kind of the best solution to it, and I think the best practice, is often for a very long time, transitioning, whether you call it decommissioning, closing down of kind of assets, or whatever you would call it, have been treated as something that needs to be thought about 10 years before the fact, right? And I find that actually in the actual design, whether it's this design of a mine, this design of a power station, whatever kind of installation or piece of industry that will attract people into that area, you've got to start thinking about after the
Yes.
life cycle
Yes.
of that particular plant or utility or whatever the case, right? And there's places where we're starting to see this. I mean, when I was just before I left mining, people were starting to think about especially mines and this nature. Unfortunately, in many instances, if you think about our power stations, they're like 50, 60 years old. So at the time that they were built, in many instances, I don't think caring about me and you was really the thought.
Yeah.
And also at the time, there was this idea that the state would come in and kind of deal with it, right? And so the planning wasn't actually, taken forward by a particular utility or whatever the case be. And I think the other thing that we do need to do is that fortunately and unfortunately, I think when a new industry does come into a particular town or a particular locality, people are quite happy to receive it, right? And we understand why. There's unemployment, there's a need for kind of socioeconomic development at a local level and so on. But we then don't, whether it's a company or utility or whatever the case, you don't actually capacitate people in such a way to say, are they thinking, right? And are they holding these institutions accountable in such a way that they're asking the questions that, okay, great, you've made so much this year, you've hired so many people this year, but when you leave in let's say 20 years time, what does that actually mean? Like, what are the alternative pieces of work that you've left here, or the alternative industries that are here? But I also think the other thing that we've got to get right is these partnership models, right? And I think in some sense, that's what we're trying to do in some sense in Komati, which is a recognition that one utility, one entity, one company will never be able to get this right. I think that has always been the big learning over the last 100 years or so, right? And so the question is, could you bring in, for example, a partnership model that brings in civil society, that brings in parts of government, brings in companies to then start thinking about the future of a sector or an industry or a locality, right? And that's what we're finding in this work in Komati, is that for us, it's not like in the presidency, I'd like to say that I'm down on the ground every single day, but it's really, how do you build those partnerships that bring that kind of specialized knowledge that different partners have. Breadline Africa is one. They are specialists in ECD, and they know how to build that infrastructure. In the presidency, we're really good at convening, right? So we know how to put this partner in touch with that person. If there's resources there, that's how we know how to do, right? And a place like, for example, Eskom or a mining company will have particular technical expertise. A government department will know how to kind of break the regulation, or rather, reform the regulation so that another industry can flourish there. It's these kind of partnership models that I think are going to be important, and they have to be embedded at the beginning of the work, instead of something that we think about.
Absolutely.
5 years.
And we can't just talk about sustainable, it's long-term
sustainability. It's very long-term. These are not easy pieces of work to do, right? And in many instances, we must also be honest about, there's always this idea that if you transition from one industry to another, that there's a like for like, it's the transition itself in terms of the energy that we're consuming in the world, but there's also the very transition of work itself, right? Whether it's a newer factory that is built or a new energy component that's built, it's less labor intensive than it used to be 40 or 50 years ago, right? So in many instances, it's not that you're going to have a power station and then there'll be renewable energy plants that are built and it'll be like for like. You've actually now got to think even more broader, right? Just to make sure that you're making up for the jobs that you've protected and then the jobs that could possibly be created as well. So it's a very complex field, but we can never use the excuse that we don't know enough, or that we've got to just kind of jump in and make sure that we're working hand in hand with the partners to resolve these very real issues.
Yeah. Earlier you mentioned the red tape that you have to deal with,
and
reducing that. What would you say are the gaps that you find when it comes to moving from policy to practice? What would you say are the gaps that you still find? Is it still just the red tape issue that you need to deal with, or is it convening partners with communities? What would you say?
Well, I think red tape is still a big issue. I mean, this has become a big focus, especially in the presidency and in government's premier reform agenda known as Operation Vulindlela. It's ultimately a big part of it about how do you enable that society in South Africa is primed for investment. So, if we look at like energy, for example, it's enabling private sector investment, but there was a lot of private red tape there. So, for example, before maybe the worst of the energy crisis, there was a cap on renewable energy that you could produce. No investor was going to come in because I think the cap was like 100 megawatts or something like that, right? Now, they can kind of build as much renewable energy as they require. And that means you can do it at scale, you can sell it into the market and so on. And the same thing is kind of true for logistics and everything else.
Sure.
All right. So red tape is still, I think, a big issue, especially if you want kind of newer industries to come into a particular area. If you think about ECDs, for example, the red tape looks a little bit different, right? It's the kind of burden that we put on ECD practitioners, for instance, right? The cost of having to register so that they can get a subsidy from the government, And we've seen some improvements. For example, before you had to be registered as an NGO, but we know that most of these businesses, most of them are actually businesses that support families as well, right? So luckily that is a piece of red tape that was taken away. So whether you're a kind of small business or so, you can be considered an ECD, but still accessing those grants is still difficult, right? And so there's a lot of work that has to take place there. But the other thing that's important is that, it's not just about the removal of red tape, even though it's very important. For me, it's like step one, step two. It's actually the capacity for implementation that also becomes quite, in government, we're really good at creating policy. Policies are always coming out, right? As you know, and it's no secret that sometimes the implementation doesn't match the policy making, right? So that's where I think we really need to put a lot of our effort. In many instances, I would say that the focus specifically of the presidency in the last, whether the sixth administration and now into the seventh administration, was how do you rebuild government capacity to do things, right, and to do them fast. Right. And so this is not just a uniquely South African problem. This is actually in many instances a global problem, right? It just takes too long to do things anymore, right? Because well-meaning as we've been, we've put so much regulation and we've made it so difficult to just go out and do things.
And then it makes it seem like you don't care.
And so it seems like you don't care, right? I mean, the other day I was talking to, because we're starting to focus on local government, and I was talking to some, officials in their province who were saying, there were these well-meaning regulations that speak about getting things like environmental, permissions and all, and they're great. They're things that we should be doing. But do you know, since we've got those regulations, they're so onerous that we haven't actually been able to build new roads as a result. So some things can be like really well-meaning, and obviously citizens, everyone will agree that they're required. But sometimes you don't think about it systemically. If I'm adding this additional regulation and there's another one and another one, does it actually make building something difficult or doing something difficult, right? So it's two things. It's making sure that we've got I think common sense regulation that protects people but enables industry and enables especially small businesses to just get on and do things, right? And especially the informal sector as well, to be dynamic. I mean, one of the things that strikes you about South Africa is the fact that you've got a very small informal sector, but a lot of employment, and that's partly of it. And then the second thing is that in our institutions, how do we rebuild that capacity to just do things and do them quickly in the best way possible? So I think those are just where some of the gaps are between policy and implementation.
Yeah. And then given your vantage view, being in the presidency, how do you ensure that that the children's voices are heard, and that indeed no child is left behind and marginalized communities remain represented?
Well, I think, luckily we've got our colleagues at the PCC, the Presidential Climate Change Commission, also in the Just Energy Transition Unit as well in the presidency. And I think one of the things that they've stressed really importantly has been this idea of it's kind of redistributive justice, but also there's this whole, concept about you've got to consult people at the beginning,
Absolutely.
throughout, and so on, right? And I think that becomes key because the platforms, there's a lot of work that goes in. And that's why sometimes people think in government we don't do our jobs, is because we spend a lot of time just trying to bring stakeholders on board and co-design with stakeholders. And I think that's been a big part of, how we've done things in Mpumalanga. The team at Breadline will tell you that we are non-ending meetings with stakeholders in Komati. Sometimes you're getting shouted at. Sometimes, sometimes they say you're doing okay. So, but that's important. That's important to go out for people to see you, to consider what they're saying, that you integrate it in how you do things. I think one thing that we could do better. I mean, luckily as a country, we have, I think, so many policies that speak to safeguarding children and really thinking through. How we make sure that the vulnerabilities of children is something that we deal with. I mean, and one is lucky, I think, to work within that particular framework and paradigm. But I think something we could do better is the actual consultation of children, right? I mean, this is, I'm not going to pretend like we're doing this, great, or we're leading in it. I think we could be a lot better. And I think it's because, quite frankly, in our society, we probably still look at children as something that must be seen, and decisions can be made on behalf. And it's quite a complex environment to enter, right? But yes, I think we need to find ways and means to actually capture their voices in the processes that we're taking on, because ultimately they are, as the colleagues had said, they are our, I don't want to say customer, but they're really the person that we're serving. So in some sense, their voice is critical.
I can imagine that when you got engaged in this project with this initiative, your perception or the way you define things kind of evolved. Like you're saying now, involving children and consulting them. That may be how meaningful community engagement may look for you. I mean, what else in terms of impact and community engagement? How is what you thought it was initially and compared to what you think it is now, having been so evolved?
I mean, maybe a bit of ignorance here. You kind of think that community engagement is about one is kind of straightforward. You go, you tell people what they want to do, and then they're going to clap for you and say, "Great, you're bringing this to our community." It's a lot more complex, right? In the sense that people aren't going to pat you in the back and thank you for coming up with ideas in Pretoria. So you really do have to. Sometimes it's okay to go to because we're always afraid to go to kind of community members and stakeholders and say, actually, we're thinking on this and we don't really have, and we want to consult you in which direction we should take, right? We always think we should come with something that is ready, set, and then give it over to them. But what we're actually finding is that people want a greater voice in what they're doing. The second thing is that we also have to recognize, as I've said before, the not just the intelligence, but the deep-seated skills that people do have, right? Often, as I indicated before, we think we're doing something on behalf of other people. And that is actually the problem. People have the skills. They just need, they just need you to do your job, right? Which is to break down the red tape, to convene when they need. But in fact, if you give them the tools, they'll be able to kind of come up with really good solutions that work way better than anything that you could have come up with. So I think these are some of the two learnings that are coming out very strongly. The thing about implementation is that kind of like that Mike Tyson quote, and not that I have a lot of Mike Tyson quotes, but I like it in the sense that it's like, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face. And implementation is like that, right? It's like, you got a plan, you think you're going to do it, but then a whole bunch of dynamics, take over. And you've got to be very kind of flexible, iterative, and be able to make those changes, right? So that becomes a very big lesson as you're implementing.
I'm sure there's sometimes there might be some level of frustration. That community leaders might have with anything government related, and you kind of come in, you're like, "Oh, I'm from the office of the president." It's like, actually, it's your fault.
Exactly.
This happened. I mean, how do you navigate that, and what frustrations have you heard, and trying to help them understand that actually this is the role we played.
Yeah.
This is the role that other entity played. There wasn't much that could be done during 1, 2, 3, and 4.
No. I think the first thing is you always have to come in and not be defensive, right? And I think this is not just true for government. This is also true in many instances for any kind of big organization that has an impact on society, whether that's a company or not. I mean, there was many times when I was in mining where I had to go into a community and be like, yeah, really, I wasn't here, but like, yes, this is what they did. So in that instance, I think you've got to listen to people. You've got to admit that what they are experiencing is real and felt, and also the fact that when you say what you say, it's going to take some time for them to trust you, because they've actually got to see some implementation and action that's actually happening for them to think that you're different to the 5 guys that came before. In some sense, while we talk about the importance of consultation, there's also a little bit of consultation fatigue, right? Because we're not the first process to come and speak to people, right? So being able to manage that ability to get people's views on board while at the same time implementing is I think is quite critical, right? And then many years ago I was taught about this thing of, I think they called it contracting, which is whenever you get into a kind of partnership with people, you've got to be very honest about your own limitations, because rather they are angry with you in some sense that you couldn't do something, but you said actually this was a limitation, and actually overselling something that you can do, right? And I think that also, what that also does is that you have a little bit of empathy, because what we forget about these is that we come with our institutions. Well, I represent this community, but really what you're doing is you're dealing with individuals and people and their emotions and the baggage that they carry and all of those kinds of things, right? So building trust between those individuals becomes quite key. So for example, if I'm dealing with a community member or a community representative, it becomes quite essential that I understand, what are the expectations of your stakeholder group, so that I never ask something of you that you can never ask back, right? And what are the limitations that you can agree with? And then the same question is asked of me. And we find that, working in that manner, that it sometimes deals with some of the risk of trust breaking down and so on, especially when you have to come and say, look, I tried, but I couldn't deliver on X. Right. And is there maybe a different way that we can do it,
I mean, and then how do you envision the presidency kind of integrating early childhood development in its development agenda?
Yeah, I mean, luckily it's already integrated in many instances. So I got a more learned colleague than I. Her name is Tejo Walker, and she runs our youth employment interventions in the presidency. And luckily, they've been looking at, one, how do you remove red tape to enable ECDs to really flourish in the way that they need to. And I think that speaks to some of the conversation that we were having, especially the registration of ECDs, the ease of access to some of the subsidies that are quite critical. But also we recognize that, ECDs in particular in these businesses become almost a driver of employment creation as well, especially in communities, because this is a service that's needed. Children need the service. And so how do we actually drive that to deal with some of the unemployment crises, the crisis that we're facing currently in the country? So it's just to say that it's actually at the core of what we're doing. There's a number of sectors that have been identified: tourism, agriculture, obviously renewable energy, and then also ECD as well. And so it's not just something that's been identified, but even in the work that happened, especially after COVID, as the economy was recovering, there was a lot of work in terms of making sure that we were taking young people that had just graduated, put them into especially primary school so they can serve as teacher assistants. And so probably as we think about the success of that work, it becomes, how do you then provide that same type of platform, especially for ECD centers, which are not so much government owned, but are very key to the pipeline of children that are going into school.
Yeah, I mean, and then given the collaboration you have with Birdline Africa, what would you say are the success stories that you've heard so far?
Yeah, well, I think there's still I think a lot of work that has to take place in order to make sure that we can establish the ECT centers in Mpumalanga and so on. But I think one from the side of the presidency certainly the convening, the bringing together of the kind of various stakeholders I think has been quite successful. I think there are now good expectations of what can be done. I think the other thing that Breadline has helped us to see is that as we think about kind of alternative industries, especially beyond Komati, that ECD is actually quite important. So, for example, one of the proposals that they've given over to we now have this financing platform in the Just Energy Transition Project Management Unit, which is really about how do you match needs, and also kind of climate financing out there. So we've got this pipeline to actually build multiple ECT centers around the Mpumalanga province as well. So I think the big strength has been just that integration between their work that they're doing, that they're thinking about long term, and what government is planning in Mpumalanga. Right? I think sometimes the consultations seem to start off a bit rough because South African consultation is never the easiest thing. You must first be put in your place and then build you up. But in that sense, I think actually we're now in a moment where things, the trust has actually built and so on. And I think we're getting more and more partners that actually want to come and fund this work. So we'll be able to see, kind of a kind of operational ECT center that's kind of rethought in a new way, that's designed in a particular way, that is just not kind of sporadic, but rather is there to serve a whole community, and then also leverages the entrepreneurs that are there. So we think we'll see that soon on the ground, and then when we can pilot that, we can do it well. It also means that we can also carry it out into other parts of Mpumalanga as well. So I think there's a lot of goodwill. I think everyone feels that in some sense they've been heard around this, and now what they want us to do is to deliver something that will make an impact in people's lives.
Yeah. And in closing, what would you say is your hope for transitioning communities like Komati?
Well, I think the hope for transitioning communities is the same hope that we have for all communities in South Africa, right? Which is effectively these are communities that can thrive. These are communities that can kind of create their own jobs, their own employment as well, but also that are capacitated enough in terms of skills and so on, so that when new industries flourish, they can take advantage of it. So I think for us, it's just that thriving communities and communities where, especially the young people, are not inhibited by the fact that they didn't live in a major city. They had all the facilities that our constitution guarantees them, and in many instances, their rights should actually get them access to. So that's effectively what we're looking for: dynamic, strong, and in some sense healthy communities.
Yeah. And what does the future look like?
For who?
That's a good question. I mean, what does the future look like when it comes to the partnerships with companies and organizations that do support early childhood development, and the office of the presidency?
Yeah. Well, I think the future, to be quite honest, it might sound a little bit boring, but it's about strengthening and bringing on more partners, right? And I think also building a partnership framework that people can easily plug into and trust, right? In many instances, we've done that around kind of the employment work. If you look at, again, my colleague, Tsako Walker, and then we also have Dr. Kate Phillip, who works on a lot of the employment stuff in the presidency. They've done this amazing piece of work where they have the likes of Harambe on board, multiple companies, the YES program, and all of that. It's this great partnership ecosystem that if someone says, hey, how do I want to support young people, they know that's the go-to. So in many instances, we would hope that this is what we do around ECD and transitioning communities, that this becomes the go-to partnership. that just adds resources, adds expertise,
Sure.
and then can expand it going forward. Yeah.
Right. The future's not bleak.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
But thank you so much, Khule, for this conversation and just being very honest about, shortcomings, the hope and successes and so on. So, I mean, I think also it's just very important that people do understand that nothing's happening.
Yeah.
Because it's not reported and somewhat not documented for the public to see doesn't mean that things aren't happening.
Yes, and I think the frustration is understandable, right? There's a lot of expectation, and in fact, it's good because we've got to move faster, we've got to go faster. So we must never really tap ourselves on the back. We could always do things a little bit better, but also at the same time. Being kind of a democratic government means that you must do things in a democratic manner. It means you must bring people on board.
Absolutely.
And sometimes that takes a little bit more time, but what it means is that what you're building becomes more resilient in the future, so that if there are elements that want to take you off guard, off rail, that you've actually got strong communities, strong buy-in from the partners that would never actually allow it. And I think in the long term, it then has bearing.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Khule, and thank you all so much for watching. We look forward to receiving your feedback, and we'll see you next time.